So last lecture, we ended by discussing the concept of sustainability as an ethos, as a great resolution between the often competing forces of self-interest and empathy. And now we're looking at resolving those forces, and I wanted to show you some examples so that you can get a sense of how this plays out. One of the ones that we're seeing very prominently is something called a B Corp. These are designed to be comprehensive and transparent social and environmental performance standards, very demanding, very hard to meet. Meeting higher accountability standards and building a business that can support other sustainable businesses. There's only 500 of these in the world, which isn't much. So while it might seem like that doesn't have a lot of impact, we're seeing these examples of an emerging worldview that can be really impactful. In the US, we have something called an L3C, which is the bridge between a nonprofit and a for-profit company where we're doing social good or environmental good while also maximizing or at least making a profit. So it's really, you're seeing these things that are emerging that are beginning to express this new worldview. And certainly all of these so-called free softwares, and I put in quotes because we do pay for these in lots of different ways, except for maybe Wikipedia, but we're seeing a different kind of way of thinking about making money where we're going to provide social good or social value that in the back end will lead to profit. And many of these have been extremely successful. And then we look at something called Csr Reporting, which is basically a corporation or a company taking stock in its sustainability efforts and trying to use those reports as ways to drive change within organizations. We can also look at something called carbon markets, which we're going to be looking at in week 5, which is really leveraging the idea of profit by creating a market for carbon. So we can make money by not emitting carbon. We can trade carbon credits, and I'll be covering more of this in a future lecture. And then we look at sustainability as reaching a tipping point. And this is an MIT Sloan report that looked at, in 2011, most companies, so let's see, 70% of respondents say that their companies have put sustainability on the management agenda. So that's going to continue and continue even with an economy that's not very solid. We also saw the green jobs movement in the late 20th century, early 21st century, where the idea was that people who have been marginalized in society through racism and exploitation perhaps now have an opportunity to gain a living wage by installing and maintaining green or sustainable technologies. Great concept. And even in a bad market, we're seeing more and more of this growth in green building market size. So these, to me, are all indications that we're moving more and more towards this new worldview. However, just in summation, I don't want us to go down this route. This is a great book by Robert Lockwood and Peter Van Gelderen about our possible futures. They look at it as a possible split between over here, which might be a sort of empathetic movement, earth balanced and regenerated, and over here, sort of status quo, the old worldview, and they're arguing that we basically die off if we continue the way we're going. And I think they're probably right, although I probably wouldn't present it that way. I would be looking at, instead, I'd be looking at this idea of the second invisible hand of empathy and the invisible hand of wealth, and I'd be beginning to think about how to unite them in a common ethos that is a sustainable future. That the only way that we're going to move fast enough in sustainability and effectively is to really unite these two worldviews together. Now, so we're getting to the end here, and you've all been very patient. Clearly, sustainability, if it's presented as a diet about reducing our impacts, is really not going to have the kind of staying power that humans are going to want. I also don't think it's actually a balance between empathy and self-interest. What I'm looking for is something that's a multiplier. And this is where we begin to see really large-scale and powerful change in society. So if sustainability is the great multiplier between self-interest and empathy, we can, instead of looking at it as an addition as 10 plus 10, so self-interest 10, empathy 10 equals 20, what I'd like to get you to be thinking about is 10 times 10. When we take this very powerful motivation of self-interest and multiply it with empathy, we're going to begin to see impacts in the world and in the environment and in society that are 100-fold of what we're seeing now. And that, if anything, doesn't get you excited about going forward and getting into next week's lectures on sustainability. I really don't know what will. So we're moving away from a worldview that's based on industry and profit. We're also going to leverage that more recent worldview of empathy and looking to mitigate damage, and really looking at a brand new worldview that is the age of integration that's going to look at maximization of profit, regenerating nature, and building equity and creating beauty. And that's really setting the tone for the next set of videos that'll be starting next week. So we're going to end our long but I think important series of lectures on motivations for sustainability. And next week, we're going to be looking at frameworks for sustainability. We're finally going to get into, I guess, what you thought this course was really all about. I hope you were happy to put up with me for this last 2 weeks, and we'll get forward and get into actual sustainability next week. We might even look at some built structures. So thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week.